Rich man forces a simple elderly woman to play the piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. The old upright piano had been sitting in the corner of the Willowbrook Community Center for as long as anyone could remember. Most days, it gathered dust, occasionally plunked by children waiting for their parents. Eleanor Jenkins passed it every Tuesday and Thursday on her way to the senior knitting circle, sometimes running her fingers lightly across the closed fallboard. 63 years had passed since she'd truly played, but her hands still knew the shape of chords. The renovation fundraiser had drawn a larger crowd than expected. Wealthy donors mingled with regular community members, champagne flutes clinking against plastic cups of punch. Eleanor stood near the wall in her best dress, watching people move through the room like they belonged in different worlds. Maxwell Harrington III dominated the center of the room, his tailored suit worth more than most people's monthly rent. His family's real estate company had been buying properties throughout the neighborhood, turning affordable housing into luxury condominiums. Yet here he was, making a show of community spirit, cameras capturing his generous donation. "This neighborhood has such character," he announced. "So authentic, so real." He gestured with his champagne, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Eleanor. "Don't you agree?" he asked, walking toward her. Eleanor clutched her small purse tighter. "It's been a good place to live," she answered simply. "You must have stories," he pressed. "Been here a while, have you?" 52 years in the same apartment, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Marvelous," Maxwell said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A neighborhood treasure." He turned to address the gathering crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have living history with us tonight." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as eyes turned toward her. She hadn't meant to become a spectacle. "Tell me," Maxwell continued, "what hidden talents might our neighborhood treasure possess?" His tone suggested amusement at her expense, as though her age precluded any possibility of skill. Before Eleanor could answer, Maxwell's gaze fell on the old piano. "Do you play?" he asked, already guiding her toward it. "I used to, but that was perfect," Maxwell interrupted. "Let's have some entertainment from a true local." He was already opening the fallboard, brushing dust from the bench. Eleanor stood frozen. The room seemed to expand and contract around her as Maxwell gestured grandly toward the bench. "I'm sure we'd all love to hear something authentic," he said, emphasizing the word to scattered laughter. Eleanor looked at the worn keys. She recognized the moment for what it was. Not an invitation, but a performance meant to elevate Maxwell by diminishing her. She could refuse, walk away with dignity intact, but shame burning inside. Or she could sit. She sat. The bench creaked beneath her weight. The room fell silent. Eleanor placed her hands on the keys. Decades melted away. She began to play. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the room, tentative at first, like water finding its path after a long drought. The piano was out of tune, some keys sticking slightly, but she adjusted, compensating for its imperfections with subtle shifts in timing and touch. Maxwell's smirk froze on his face. He had expected fumbling, embarrassment, a few wrong notes before a gracious rescue. Instead, music poured from the old instrument, transforming the community center's fluorescent-lit room into something else entirely. Eleanor closed her eyes. Her shoulders, normally curved with age, straightened as muscle memory awakened. The piece built slowly, gathering momentum like a confession long held silent. When she reached the climax, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision and passion, someone in the crowd gasped. Eleanor didn't hear it. She had traveled somewhere else, to concert halls she'd never played in, to the small Brooklyn apartment where she'd practiced on an upright, much like this one. As the final notes faded, Eleanor kept her hands on the keys. The silence that followed was complete, weighted with collective breath held too long. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then building, filling the room with sound almost as powerful as the music had been. She opened her eyes to find Maxwell staring at her, his expression a complex mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been respect. Around him, people were standing, their faces showing genuine emotion rather than polite interest. "That was extraordinary," said a woman Eleanor recognized from the apartment building across the street. "I had no idea." "Where did you study?" asked another voice from the crowd. Eleanor smoothed her dress as she stood. "Juilliard," she said quietly. "For 2 years, before life took a different turn." Maxwell stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "What an unexpected treat," he said. "This is exactly the kind of community treasure we're working to preserve." But people weren't listening to him anymore. They surrounded Eleanor, asking questions, sharing their own memories of music and missed opportunities. Margaret Wilson, who ran the community center's after-school program, pushed through the crowd. "Eleanor, would you consider teaching piano here? We have so many children who would benefit, and clearly, you have extraordinary talent." Before Eleanor could answer, Maxwell interjected, "What a wonderful idea. In fact, Harrington Developments would be honored to donate a new piano." Eleanor looked at him directly. "This piano has character," she said, echoing his earlier word. "It's authentic, real." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "But a second one for the children would be welcome." Someone laughed, then others joined in. Maxwell's face flushed slightly before he mastered it with a practiced smile. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We'll discuss the details." As the crowd's attention shifted, Maxwell leaned closer to Eleanor. "Where have you been hiding all these years?" he asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his polished veneer. Eleanor straightened the front of her dress. "Not hiding, Mr. Harrington, just living." The following Tuesday, Eleanor arrived at the community center earlier than usual. Instead of heading directly to the knitting circle, she lingered by the piano. The events of the fundraiser had stirred something she'd long thought dormant. Not just music, but purpose. Margaret greeted her warmly. "I've had 17 calls about piano lessons since Friday," she said. "Seems you've become something of a local celebrity." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm just an old woman who remembered something she used to love." "Well, that something moved a lot of people." Margaret hesitated, including, apparently, Maxwell Harrington. "His office called this morning." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "About the new piano." "Yes, but not only that. He wants to meet with you personally to discuss what he's calling a cultural initiative for the neighborhood." Before Eleanor could respond, the center's front door swung open. Maxwell Harrington strode in, as out of place in the morning light as a peacock in a chicken coop. Today he wore no tie with his expensive suit, an apparent attempt at casual approachability. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called, crossing the room with his hand extended. "I hoped I might catch you here." Eleanor accepted his handshake briefly. "Mr. Harrington, I understand you've been making plans involving me." Margaret pointed them toward a small office, then excused herself with a meaningful look at Eleanor that clearly said, "Be careful." Once seated, Maxwell leaned forward eagerly. "I've been thinking about your talent and the impact it clearly had on the community. It's exactly the kind of local color that makes neighborhoods special." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "Local color," she repeated. "A poor choice of words," he acknowledged quickly. "What I mean is, you represent something authentic in a world increasingly dominated by digital experiences." "I'm just a person who played piano," Eleanor said. "Nothing more symbolic than that." Maxwell smiled. "But that's precisely what makes it powerful. Your story, Juilliard-trained pianist living quietly in this neighborhood for decades, rediscovered by chance, it resonates." "I'm proposing a series of concerts," Maxwell said. "Small, intimate gatherings where you play and perhaps share some of your experiences. We'd hold them in various properties throughout the neighborhood. We'd record them, create a documentary about your life and the changing face of the neighborhood. The neighborhood your company is actively changing, Eleanor noted. Maxwell didn't flinch. Progress is inevitable, Mrs. Jenkins, but it doesn't have to erase history. He named a substantial figure for Eleanor's participation. She studied him. This man who'd intended to mock her just days ago and now saw her as an opportunity. Why the sudden interest in an old woman's piano playing? Maxwell hesitated, then seemed to decide on honesty. Because I underestimated you, and it made me wonder, what else? Who else? I've been underestimating in this community. His answer surprised her. And how would these concerts benefit the community? Not just Harrington Development's image, Maxwell smiled. 50% of all proceeds would go directly to the community center's renovation fund. Plus, we'd establish a scholarship for music education for local children. Eleanor considered his offer. I'll think about it, she said finally. But I have conditions of my own. 1 month later, Eleanor sat at a gleaming Steinway in what had once been the Garfield Building's main lobby. The historic structure, recently acquired by Harrington Developments, had been slated for demolition. Now, thanks to her first condition, it would be renovated instead, with affordable housing units included alongside the luxury apartments. The space had been transformed for the evening's concert, the first in the series. Rows of chairs faced the piano, most already filled with a mixture of longtime neighborhood residents and newcomers. Backstage, Maxwell paced nervously. Full house, he reported. Press in the back row. The documentary team is set up. Eleanor nodded calmly. She wore a simple black dress, her white hair arranged more carefully than usual. At 79, she had never expected to give a formal recital again. Remember, Maxwell said, just a brief introduction about yourself before you play. I remember our agreement, Eleanor replied. Her second condition had been complete artistic control over her performances. No scripted remarks, no repertoire chosen for maximum emotional impact. When Eleanor took the stage, the applause was immediate and warm. She settled herself at the piano, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertip. Good evening, she began, her voice carrying surprisingly well. My name is Eleanor Jenkins. 63 years ago, I was Eleanor Abrams, a piano student at Juilliard with dreams of concert halls much grander than this one. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. Life intervened, as it often does. I met James Jenkins, fell in love, married. When he got a job offer in this neighborhood, we moved here, into a small apartment with walls too thin for a practicing pianist. We planned to stay just a year or two. Eleanor smiled at the memory. 2 years became 5, became 10. We had a daughter, then a son. James worked long hours as an engineer. I took a job as a secretary. There was never enough money, never enough time. The piano became a distant memory. From the corner of her eye, she could see Maxwell watching intently. This wasn't the simple narrative he'd imagined, the hidden genius discovered late in life. It was messier, more ordinary. James passed away 20 years ago. The children grew up, moved away. I stayed in the same apartment where we began our life together. This neighborhood became home in ways I never expected. She adjusted her posture, hands poised above the keys. I'm telling you this because Mr. Harrington asked me to share my story. But the truth is, my story isn't remarkable. What's remarkable is that all of us have parts of ourselves we set aside. Talents, dreams, possibilities. Sometimes, if we're fortunate, we get the chance to reclaim them. Eleanor began to play. Not Debussy this time, but Bach, the prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Her fingers moved with certainty across the keys, finding the patterns they'd learned so long ago. As she played, Eleanor glanced occasionally at the audience. She saw tears on some faces, recognition on others. When she finished the Bach, she moved seamlessly into Chopin, then Schubert. Each piece told its own story, of technical challenges overcome, of emotions expressed through melody and harmony. For her final piece, she chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a technically demanding work she had never mastered in her youth. In the weeks since the fundraiser, she had practiced daily, her fingers gradually regaining strength and flexibility. When the last thunderous chord faded, the silence that followed seemed to vibrate with collective emotion. Then came the applause, standing, immediate, genuine. Eleanor rose, acknowledging it with a slight bow. As she left the stage, Maxwell waited, his expression unguarded for once. "That was," he began, then shook his head, words failing him. Eleanor smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "It was." The concert series continued through the spring, each performance drawing larger crowds than the last. The documentary crew followed Eleanor through her daily routines, capturing her knitting circle friendships, her shopping at the local market, her practice sessions at the community center. 2 more pianos had appeared there, the promised new one from Harrington Developments, and another donated by a local family. Eleanor now taught 3 days a week, her students ranging from wide-eyed 5-year-olds to retirees even older than herself. The waiting list grew longer each month. She kept her fees low for neighborhood children and waived them entirely for those who couldn't afford to pay. Maxwell attended every concert, watching from the wings rather than taking the spotlight. Eleanor had observed subtle changes in him. He listened more, spoke less definitively, seemed genuinely interested in the community's reaction to the music and to the changes his company was implementing. The Garfield building renovation proceeded with more community input than initially planned. Other Harrington properties followed suit. It wasn't perfect. Gentrification continued. Some longtime residents still found themselves priced out. But there was dialogue now, compromise, adjustments made. After the 5th concert, Maxwell approached Eleanor with a legal document. "The Scholarship Foundation is official," he said. "The Eleanor Jenkins Music Education Fund, endowed in perpetuity." Eleanor scanned the document, noting the substantial sum allocated annually. "This is more than we discussed," Maxwell shrugged. "The concerts have been more successful than projected, and I've added some personal funds as well." She studied him. This man who had intended to humiliate her months ago. "Why?" "Because you made me see something I'd missed. Value isn't always visible on the surface. Communities aren't just real estate opportunities. They're complex ecosystems of lives and stories." Eleanor nodded. "And what happens when the concert series ends? When the documentary is finished? Will Harrington Developments remember these insights?" "That's my 3rd condition," Eleanor said, surprising him. "I want a permanent seat on Harrington Developments' Community Advisory Board. Not just for me, but for representatives from every neighborhood where you build. Real decision-making power, not just consultation." Maxwell's expression flickered through surprise, calculation, resistance, and finally, reluctant respect. "That's an unconventional approach to real estate development." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "just as an elderly woman giving piano concerts is an unconventional approach to community revitalization. Yet, here we are." He laughed, the sound genuine. "You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Jenkins." "Eleanor," she corrected. "And yes, I do." After a long moment, Maxwell extended his hand. "We'll draw up the paperwork." The final concert took place exactly 1 year after the community center fundraiser, where Eleanor had first played. The venue was the renovated Garfield building lobby, now a permanent community performance space. Her 4th and final condition: every seat was filled. Eleanor had seen rough cuts of the documentary, titled The Neighborhood Pianist, and had been surprisingly moved by the story it told. Not just hers, but the community's, its resilience and adaptation in the face of change. As Eleanor settled at the piano, she noticed faces that had become familiar: students and their families, neighbors, even some critics who had written glowingly about these intimate concerts with an unexpected virtuoso. In the front row sat her daughter and son, who had flown in for this final performance, their presence a healing of old distances. Maxwell stood at the back, alongside Margaret from the community center and several neighborhood council members. The advisory board had already met twice, with spirited debates and actual compromises reached on upcoming projects. For my final program, Eleanor began, I'd like to play something different. Until now, I've performed works by the great classical composer, music I learned in my youth and have rediscovered in my old age. She positioned her hands above the keys. Tonight, I'll play a piece I've composed myself. It's called the Willowbrook Variations, named for this neighborhood that has been my home for over 5 decades. Eleanor began to play. The piece opened with a simple, almost hesitant melody, like her first tentative notes at the fundraiser, then gradually built in complexity and confidence. She had woven in elements from the classical tradition she loved, but also hints of jazz heard from street musicians, snippets of the Dominican merengue that played from apartments in Summer Fear, echoes of the gospel choir from the church around the corner. As the music filled the space, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. Not an ending. She would continue teaching, continue serving on the advisory board, perhaps even compose more music, but the closing of a circle that had opened 63 years ago, when a young pianist set aside one dream for another. The final variation returned to the simple melody, now transformed by all that had come before it. As Eleanor played the last notes, she felt tears on her cheeks, not of regret for paths not taken, but of gratitude for this unexpected gift, the chance to bring her music back into the world, to matter in ways she never anticipated. The applause, when it came, washed over her like a blessing. Eleanor rose, acknowledging it with a deep bow, then gestured toward the audience. The building, the neighborhood beyond, all part of the composition she had helped create. As she left the stage, Maxwell waited, as he had after every concert. But this time, instead of speaking, he simply offered his arm to escort her into the crowd, where her students, neighbors, and family waited to congratulate her. Eleanor Jenkins, 79 years old, neighborhood pianist, took his arm and stepped forward into the next movement of her life.